personally welcome you to our great conversation towards wholeness. This is a Divinity conversation on gender, sexuality, and marriage. It's a 3-part series, and this is the final series, then the 3rd part, which is meditations on community, reasoning together around marriage and equality. I am your co-moderator. My name is Dustin Baker. I am a 3rd year seminary, graduating seminarian. And I am from North New Jersey, and so I want to introduce our other co-moderator, Jamaica. Wait, now I have to do this right because we just had a really interesting conversation. Jamaica Jones-Sessler, and she's from Prince George's County, Maryland. She's a 1st-year seminarian, and since we're talking about marriage, she's been married for 7 years. Now get this. Yay! She wanted me to say she's the proud parent of an American bulldog named Zena. So we were in conversation of marriage. We have proud pet parents in the house. Amen. So I'm going to just do some housekeeping rules, and then our co-moderator is going to take over. Right now, this is a relaxed atmosphere. We just want all conversations to be welcome at the table. Every opinion, every question, every wrestling. Let's have a conversation as a community. And please don't hold back. Let's talk in love and speak in love. Amen? Amen. So I'm going to get out your way. Here we go.
Welcome again. Thanks for coming. I'm going to quickly introduce our panel. We have Dr. Alice Bellis. She's the professor of Old Testament language and literature. Dr. Michael Newheart. He's the professor of New Testament language and literature. Dr. Harold Trulear. He serves as the associate professor of applied theology and the director of Doctor of Ministry. We also have 2 students who will be joining us today. Both of them are 3rd-year MDiv students. They graduated this year. Orlando Pickens and Mark Johnson. They will be speaking. Our first half, Dr. Bellis and Dr. Newheart will be doing a joint presentation on Old Testament biblical literature, Old Testament biblical perspective and New Testament biblical perspective. Following up with Dr. Trulear, he'll be speaking on pastoral reflection, and then Mark and Orlando will be giving our contemporary reflections. Following that, we'll have Q&A. Welcome, Dr. Bellis and Dr. Newheart.
This is the first time that Dr. Newheart and I have called this team teaching, even though we started here together 20 years ago. And team teaching is always 100 times more work than just doing it yourself, especially the first time around. So we'll see how this goes. As we start, we're calling this same gender, sex, and marriage, and we're doing both testaments. The Bible actually doesn't have a whole lot to say explicitly about marriage. It doesn't really have a whole lot to say about same-gender sex either. We will deal with the texts that either talk about these matters or that people think relate to these matters. And we also will talk about principles of interpretation because those are important when we're dealing with these sorts of matters. So onward and upward, or sideways, or down, one way or the other. So main points. First of all, we all interpret. We'll deal with 3 Hebrew Bible texts and 3 New Testament texts and what we're calling intertext. And then finally, go ye therefore and interpret. So, First of all, no magic bullets. We all interpret. So the example...
No non-magic bullets either.
Right. No bullets of any sort, by which you can be sure that you've got the right answer, which is what I mean by a magic bullet. So, without anybody opening a Bible, no fair opening a Bible, keep all Bibles, Logos, anything else closed for the moment. Esther 1, verses 10 and 11. What did the king ask the queen to wear to the party? That's the queen, or at least it's somebody's version of the queen. Okay, did he ask her to wear her crown, her royal robes? Both or neither? So, which is it? Without looking at the text, just based on your memory of the story, make a decision in your head. Was she supposed to come dressed with her robes and her crown, all dressed up? Just her crown, just her robe? So make your decision, and then I'll show you the text. Everybody, oh, actually, we should take a vote. Okay, how many for robes and crown? Let's see a hand. Okay, 1, 2, 3. You don't know that. 1, 2, 3. I see 3 out there. So that's for the full regalia. How many just for the robes? Nobody there. How many just for the crown? Okay, I think just the crown is winning this vote. So more for just the crown than for the whole regalia, and nobody just for the robes. So here's what it says. We did. It disappeared. Okay. Well, what the text actually says in our work on our PowerPoint, that slide has disappeared. What the text actually says is that, and you can get your Bible out now, and we actually brought it with you, is that the king asked the queen to come to the party wearing her crown. Period. Period. It's ambiguous. You're all right. You can interpret it either way. But we interpret it without even being aware that we've interpreted it, is the point. Some of us interpret it that she's supposed to get all dressed up. Some of us interpreted that she's supposed to only wear her crown. So depending on how you interpret it, may say something about, well, we'll leave it at that.
So as we fill in the gaps in our interpretation, for what purpose do we interpret? And so since we're here at Howard University School of Divinity, it's important that we bring up the mission statement, particularly the last couple lines of the mission statement, which are important. That is that our mission statement is, or that we are driven by a passion for justice and freedom and a relentless search for truth. So that our exegesis, our interpretation, will be guided by these values. And so another question that needs to be answered is, in whose interest do we interpret? And oftentimes I hear students say that they minister to the lost, to the least, and to the left out. So if that is true, that we are interpreting for the interest of the lost, the least, and the left out, how does that shape our interpretation, especially as we interpret passages in relationship to marriage, and particularly same-sex marriage?
probably the most well-known text in the entire Bible that people think of when they think of same-sex sexuality is Sodom and Gomorrah, right? That's the one that immediately jumps to mind, of fire and brimstone and all of that. But if you actually think about the story, it's, well, okay, what's happening here? Oh, it's going sideways, then. Okay, sorry, getting used to this computer. It's attempted male-on-male rape, right? The townspeople, the text actually says it is every last male in town come and want to know the strangers. And in the context, clearly the word know here, which can in various contexts mean sex, in this context it's absolutely clear that they want to know them sexually. Every last man in town wants to know the strangers, and they are banging on the doors trying to get in. It's clear that this is not a story about consensual sex, it's a story about attempted homosexual rape. The Sodom and Gomorrah story is mentioned numerous times in the Bible. Numerous times. Their sin is never called consensual male-on-male, homosexual, whatever you want to call it, sex. No term remotely related to male-on-male consensual sex. It's called all kinds of things, some of which seem very odd to us from our modern perspective. The closest any of these texts that allude to Sodom and Gomorrah get to male-on-male sex is one text where it talks about general perverted sex. That's as close as it ever gets. But no time ever in all the many references does any Bible text ever call what happens at Sodom and Gomorrah anything like homosexuality, homosexual sex, or anything close, close to that. So, bottom line is, if we are concerned with ethics of consensual sexuality, this text, even though it's the one that we first think about, is really not a text that really ought to be part of the debate at all. Because it's a text about rape, attempted rape, but since we're talking about questions of consensual sexual behavior, it really shouldn't be on the table. But it has to be because everybody always thinks of it first. Now the second text, still on. The second text is really a pair of texts. Leviticus 18:22 says no male-on-male sex. It's an abomination, the text says. In Hebrew, toeva. And the word toeva in Hebrew refers to a serious ritual violation. We hear the word toeva, or in English we hear the word abomination, and that sounds like something that is absolutely horrendous, and we immediately, our shackles go up. But in Hebrew, this is referring to something in the ritual area, which is a whole domain, the whole domain is hard for us to understand. Leviticus 18 is part of something called the Holiness Code, and holiness in the ancient biblical world is not the same as what we think of as holiness today. It's not the same as a moral or ethical type of holiness. It is much more in the cultic or ritual purity area. Other types of rules that you get in the Holiness Code are rules which say that you may not wear two sorts of fiber mixed together in one cloth. Probably most of us in the room don't even know what's in the cloth that we're wearing. But I suspect most of us are in violation of various provisions of the Holiness Code. You couldn't sow two different kinds of seed in the same field. Many of the hybrid types of seed that are being developed today definitely are against this. Of course, there are many reasons that they're not a good thing. That's a whole other discussion. But these are the kinds of things that were considered against the Holiness Code. They were wrong for reasons that are different from what we think of as moral or ethical reasons. Now, there probably were reasons, too, that had to do with practicalities, such as the fact that the Hebrews were a rural agricultural people who needed to produce as many children as possible. In that day and age, there was high infant mortality. And given that fact, they were very concerned to produce as many children as possible. There's a whole other line of argument along that line, but let me just leave it at that for now. Then Leviticus 20:13 is the other half of the pair. And this essentially is the penalty if you violate 1822. The penalty was execution. Some Christians, quite a few still, of course, accept Leviticus 18:22 as still binding on Christians. But there are very few Christians today who accept Leviticus 20:13. We tend to think that those who accept 20:13 are nutcases. They're the type of people who are, who go to abortion clinics and try to kill the doctors. But if one of our principles is consistency, it's a little hard to pick and choose your provisions unless we end up with a different principle that we'll talk about later in terms of our principles. But these two texts go together. No male on male sexual behavior, and the penalty being death. And the last one, which is a different sort of text, and this one is not dealing with male on male homosexual sex, but is a different sort of text entirely, Genesis 2:24. This is one of the few texts in the Hebrew Bible that deals explicitly with marriage. And it says that a man leaves his parents, cleaves unto his wife, and the two become one flesh. Everybody knows this text. It's quoted frequently in weddings. Now, some say that this mandates male-female marriage. You all know this argument, I'm sure. But there are some problems with this perspective. First of all, there are quite a few polygamous marriages in the Hebrew Bible, and that would suggest that this text in Genesis 2:24 is not a text that says that this is the only acceptable pattern, but rather it's the pattern that is the most common pattern. There's an additional problem that is actually far more important than the polygamous marriages we find with people like Abraham and Jacob. And this is, what do we do about biblical singles like Jeremiah and Jesus, who clearly don't fit the pattern of Jeremiah 2:24? So they are a more difficult problem than the polygamous marriages that we have. And I think that's it. Newheart.
And now I want to make clear when there was a reference to in sex, that wasn't miraculous, Michael. and the MF sex was male, female, and not anything else. Okay? So we have three New Testament texts. First being 1 Corinthians 6:9, which reads, "Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Well, do not be deceived." And then we have a long list of folks that will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And in the New International Version, a couple of folks that are in this vice list, and vice lists are throughout the New Testament as well as in other literature of the day. The translation here is male prostitutes. In the Greek there is malakoi, which I've put in Greek letters and then transliterated into English characters. And I'm aware that several of you here have signed up for Greek in the fall, so you'll be getting to know that. So thank you. Look forward to seeing you. As I often say, that every translation is an interpretation. So when you're dealing with an English translation, you're already dealing with an interpretation. So, but then, oh yes, the first one is male prostitutes and malakoi, and the second one that's listed, well, no, actually, you have to get a little bit farther in the list. Actually, you've got the male prostitutes one is the fourth one listed. Right, and right, yeah. Go to the next slide. So anyway, okay, inquiring minds want to know. So also the NRSV says male prostitutes, sodomites. And also we have in 1 Timothy 1:10, we have a word which is translated by the NIV, which was earlier. I mean, this is the same word here, which earlier, for 1 Corinthians 6:9, it's translated homosexual offenders. And that means you offend a homosexual, but anyway. But here it's translated as perverts, which Harry Potter's buddy doesn't like. However, in the NRSV, it is rendered as sodomites. However, what Harry tells us that it means is the malakoi, the first one that was translated by the NRSV as male prostitutes, really means effeminate. And it's someone who just was judged as sort of a man who was judged as violating, so to speak, by dressing, acting, whatever, outside the male norm, so to speak. And the other one, arsenakotoi, is probably, and again, we're really not sure because there's not a lot of literature, and all this literature is written by elite males. And so it seems that the arsenakotoi, which is done as homosexual offenders or perverts or sodomites, which doesn't say sodomites, that doesn't really say anything other than I guess you were from Sodom, which got destroyed. Oh well. But it seems that the arsenakotoi were those people who had sex for benefit, not just monetary benefit, though that could be possible, but for sex for their own benefit, physical, emotional, etc. And that was not necessarily same sex. So this is FWB, I guess, in the ancient world, friends with benefits. Okay, then finally we have Romans 1, 26 and 27. And let me read that in the NRSV. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way, also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. What is this talking about? Is Paul talking about lesbianism? If so, he's the first one or only one in his era to talk about women sex relations. Elite men weren't interested in that, at least according to what the written records left behind. Are we here talking about gays? And the penalty is that HIV/AIDS. Well, as my students know, that have often heard me say, context is everything. Context is everything. Oftentimes, we fill in these gaps that we talked about with the Esther story at the beginning by projecting our modern context. So, as a result, we read Romans 1, 26 to 27 in terms of what we think of in terms of women and women, unnatural intercourse, and men. But the question always is that what was going on in the ancient world? Is that what was being addressed? Also, it's important to look at Romans and in the earlier text, 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, in its entirety. And so the emphasis in Romans is the justice of God. The justice of God that God creates for both Jews and Gentiles to enter into the covenant through the faithfulness of Jesus. And so every paragraph needs to be read according to that overall theme. And my student says the first time you've heard that before, right? So here in the first section of Romans, in which the theme is the justice of God, Paul immediately turns to talk about the injustice of humanity. So after chapter 4, he can talk about that one about the justice of God. So in 1:18 to 32, he turns his sights on the Gentiles. And 3 times he said, God gave them up. God gave them up. God gave them up. And he's saying much the same things that his fellow Jewish writers were saying about Gentiles. Oh, the Gentiles. They're doing all kinds of stuff. Idolaters. Ooh, bad this. And so, as this was being read in the Roman church, the Jews, Paul, the Jews, they're bad business. They're bad business. But then, in 2:1, Paul shifts and saying, don't judge, or you Jews are guilty of the very same things. And then in the last section of that, 3:9 to 20, all are guilty of sin. And all are unjust. And therefore he comes in with chapter 4, well actually at the end of chapter 3, talking about the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. So 1:26 to 27 is one example of the injustice of the Gentiles, which is, as I said, similar to other writings of Jews. There is nothing unusual about what Paul says in 1:26 to 27. But what's he talking about? Well, his main thing here is natural over against unnatural intercourse. Well, okay, what's that mean? As we look at other literature of the day, natural intercourse in that context was vaginal procreative sex. That is, sex which led to children. Therefore, unnatural sex was anal, non-procreative sex. And Augustus had a condom distribution program going on at the time. Or another example the unnatural sex that was going on. According to the literature, between slaves and masters. So in other words, the power differential, a dominating relationship, an oppressive relationship. Another kind that we see from other writings, almost using the same word as Paul does, is the antics of Caesar's household. Like Caligula, a corrupt, wicked, or at least a person who did wicked and corrupt and unseemly things, at least according to historians such as Suetonius and some of the other writers of the time, with much the same language. And so it has sometimes been argued that what Paul has in mind here is Caligula and his family and the weird stuff that they've been doing. What it doesn't seem to refer to is what we understand as homosexuality or homosexual relationships. That is what it doesn't seem is going on here, or at least Paul has in mind, is same-sex egalitarian relationships. For that matter, though Paul moves in this direction, at times even male-female relationships are not as egalitarian as we would like. Indeed, the first century world was a slave-oriented patriarchal culture. There were ways in which Christianity and other Jews, other movements were a protest against that, but that was the context. Paul uses the word natural in other contexts. For example, he says that it's natural in 1 Corinthians 11:14-15 for men to have short hair and women to have long hair. This man is unnatural, at least according to Paul. He's a, Rastaman. Also, in Romans, he says that God does something unnatural with the olive trees. Because he says that, naturally, you as, not you, but the Jews, have been broken off because of unbelief. And so the Gentiles have been grafted on in an unnatural way. And so the Jews will be grafted back on too, again in an unnatural way. So God is guilty of an unnatural act, numerous unnatural acts, according to Paul.
Okay, so having run through all of our basic biblical texts that talk, or people think talk in some way or another about same-sex sex or marriage, we want to move now to talking a little bit more about interpretation. The first thing is to look at the way the Bible itself interprets itself. So two texts in the Hebrew Bible. First of all, Isaiah 56, 3-7, which is part of what we call Third Isaiah, which is in the post-exilic period after the Hebrews had been exiled in Babylon and they come back home again. And basically what this Isaiah says is let the eunuchs and the foreigners join the Israelite community as long as they observe the Sabbath, as they do the basic requirements of Judaism. So there's I typed eunuch into Google and that's what popped up. And that's supposed to be Ruth. But the interesting thing is, if you look up Deuteronomy 23:1-3, it says no eunuchs and no foreigners. So Third Isaiah is making a 180-degree turn from the basic Israelite law. and they're both in the Hebrew Bible. And either the later text is intended to be a major change from the earlier one, as is the case with the way we interpret the law today, or both of them are in the same canon, and you take your pick. I think I prefer that the later text interprets the earlier text, and we go with the later text. Similarly, the book of Ruth, you have a Moabite as the hero of the story, and she, according to the genealogy at the end of the book, is an ancestor of David. And although there's some debate about the dating of the book, many scholars, and I'm certainly one of them, believe that the book was also post-exilic. It was written to challenge the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, who told the Jewish men who were married to foreign women to divorce their foreign wives and to send the foreign wives and the half-breed children away. Again, in the same spirit, disagreeing with Deuteronomy 23 that said no foreigners. Book of Ruth, I think, is saying, yes, the foreigners, as long as they uphold the basic tenets of Judaism, which Ruth certainly did, your God shall become my God, etc. She became a good Jew, and as such, she became a part of the community and was the ancestor of David, according to the story. So now, well, I'll continue there. So the trajectory in the Hebrew Bible, which continues into the New Testament, is toward including ever more people who were formerly considered outside the pale. Eunuchs and foreigners in the Hebrew Bible, prostitutes, tax collectors. Oops. There's my prostitute picture, and maybe a little hard to see, but that's a modern tax collector. Okay, 2 minutes, wrap it up. Okay.
2 minutes, wrap it up.
Talk fast.
Okay. We reinterpreted contemporary relation to following Jesus' footsteps. Mark 10, 11 and 12. Okay, so where does that leave us? Uncertainty? Well, actually, that leaves us with much certainty. Because we have Micah, what does the Lord require of you? Seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly with our God. And Luke, quoting, of course, Isaiah 61, speaks of freedom, freedom for the captives. And then the miracles of Jesus, which I'm working on specifically, Jesus gives these people dignity. Indeed, in faculty meeting, I heard that we are considering for self-study a tagline, so to speak, of depth, dignity, and determination. And I'm working on a project on the hermeneutic of dignity. So I was pleased to know that we're at least thinking about that as a tagline. But how do texts help free folks, help us pursue justice, help us lift and dignify people? The Wesleyan Quadrilateral has been important to me in terms of discernment, that there are 4 things that we look at, not just Scripture, but it's an important thing, but also reason, experience, and tradition. Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, put the pictures there. God loves you just the way you are, but He loves you too much to leave you that way. That's whatever your position is on same-sex marriage, sexuality, it's okay. But it's not okay to stay there, no matter where you are. Continuing to question, continue to discern, continue to discern what a particular position means in the context of the beloved community. Here are some resources that I think are helpful. A couple of websites, othersheep.org, and Tom Hanks, not the actor, as you can see, that, of course, after World War II, things happen to you. But anyway, theologian Thomas Hanks, who says life is just like a box of, Bible is just like a box of chocolates. But anyway, and then Rob Gagnon, who tends to be more conservative. Hanks is more liberal. Gagnon is more conservative. Some good resources. Also, there's some films that are good. For the Bible Tells Me So, which I think you can download online if you have certain things. Also, if you have a copy. And then a TV movie a couple years back with Sigourney Weaver, Prayers for Bobby. And then, in conclusion, I have a jazz poem. This is National Poetry Month, and also Jazz Appreciation Month. So, this is a little jazz poem entitled Clobber Text. Clobber Text. These texts, Genesis, Leviticus, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, Romans, they're called clobber text. Maybe slobber text. No, clobber text. So yeah, let's clobber with them. Clobber, clobber, clobber. That's what God gave them for, wasn't it? I think I hear a song come to mind. It's not a jazz song, but hey, you can make anything a jazz song. Think of Train with my favorite things. So let's do it. If I had a clobber text, yeah, baby. If I had a clobber text, I'd clobber in the morning, I'd clobber in the evening, I'd clobber all over this land. I'd clobber out danger. Yeah, that's what I'd do. I'd clobber out warning. Yeah, warning, baby. I'd clobber out, you hear me? I'd clobber out love. I say love between my brothers and my sisters. I say love all over this land. Yeah.
Let's thank Dr. Bellis and Dr. Newheart for their presentation. Clap. Never pass Dr. Bellis a note because he will read it out loud for everybody. But now we're going to transition. By the way, real quick before we transition, I would like to let you know that we have a blog going on right now. You can go online right now. The conversation will continue, and I have the note here. Linwood, where are you? Okay, it is husdsga.blogspot.com. So you can go there right now. If you have your computers, or even after this conversation, we'll be engaging in the biblical perspective, and the pastoral perspective, and the contemporary perspective, and asking questions, posting our opinions, and still keeping the conversation going. Amen? Right now we're going to transition into our pastoral perspective, and Dr. Trulear will guide us along the way with that right now. Let's give him a hand.
Yeah, This is actually going to be a combination of pastoral perspective and sociological perspective. I was supposed to have presented from a sociological perspective last week. Unfortunately, during my time allotted by the university, the County of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and other plans for me was included a holding cell. So, but I did think of you. So, and I thank you for thinking of me. So, what I want to do is sort of bring them together autobiographically. And Professor Newheart has given me a helpful way to think about this in terms of changing. What are you doing? Why are you picking those up? Okay, we need clean up. Why would you describe picking those up as cleaning up?
I don't know. I'm sure you'll tell me.
I mean, what's wrong with those being in the middle of the floor?
Oh, no reason.
Okay. Professor Newheart talked about evolving positions, and I'm certainly open to hearing from my esteemed biblical colleagues, though I do not share their interpretive perspective. But my role is not to dispute with them. I'm not a Bible scholar. I know that there are Bible scholars who disagree with them. And so I will leave that to the Bible scholars who disagree with them to enter into the textual argument. That's not my role. My role is to look at this as a pastor and religious leader heavily informed by sociological perspective, because while I do hold and subscribe to the position that homosexuality is sinful behavior, what has been interesting for me as an individual and then as a pastor has been the evolution of my position on how to handle that position. I see my position as one of evolving from homophobia and serious homophobia to one of seeking justice while holding to the theological position that I described earlier. What for me was most important was wondering why this sin in my own pantheon of sins was so problematic. What was being threatened when my emotions would rile against those who were practicing or advocating homosexuality? Some of it was personal. I was around it all the time. I went to an all-male high school, I went to an all-male college, and I was a music major. I was tired of people referring to me as a member of the Morehouse Gay Club, as opposed to the Morehouse Glee Club. And so there was a lot of emotion that went into my understanding of homosexuality, emotion that was probably deeper than my theological conviction. Finally, Margaret Mead helped me understand something of the emotion surrounding my position. And it was on her advice that I brought these visual aids today. Everything on the floor is useful. There are Harambe programs. There are full bottles of water. There's a box in which you can ship things. Even cards are telling us how much time we have left, and if we don't use it, they are useful. And this is good for packing, and it's good for copying. Very useful. Yet, it was interesting how Brother Dion used the term clean up when he described Brother Sampson picking up. Because you clean something that's dirty. The floor is dirty. And Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, says that dirt is defined as matter out of place. In other words, if I take this box and I put it somewhere else, the floor is no longer dirty. There's nothing wrong with the box. It's that the box is in the wrong place. One of the things we know about the human body is the clear connection between what we see, how we feel and respond physically, and dirt. Dirt can make you throw up. Not physical dirt, like soil. In fact, if you were to go out on the Howard's lawn, you would not say the lawn is dirty. You would say the lawn is filled with soil, because that's where it belongs. But if you threw that same dirt on the floor, some of us would have, in the cafeteria, some of us would have trouble eating. Because the matter's out of place. We are reviled. My argument is that while it's important for me to affirm the sinfulness of sexual immorality, including homosexuality, I need, as a sociologist, to pay attention to the emotions that come up, to matter out of place, in this case, the sex act. The sex act out of place, place meaning the marriage relationship, calls up a level of emotion and revulsion that has more to do with place than it does theological truth. If sin is sin, then why so much emotion over this one? If sin is sin, why so much revulsion over this one? So the challenge of my growth in being a pastor has been, how do I separate the revulsion and the emotion that comes up by my response to this matter out of place, whether it's homosexuality or adultery or, as we say in the black church, fornication. Never heard that before, then you were raised in a very, very sophisticated church. It's fornication, that's the right way. Just like the pastoral prayer. You put an eye on it. The issue for me is the revulsion that emerges, and I'm keeping this, and I'm reading much of this from a blog to which Dr. Sanders and I contributed on urbanfaith.com in the wake of the Haley Long scandal. And so, as a leader, I had to learn to show compassion to people that I believe were participating in immoral behavior, and to not be revulsed by them. Not to allow cultural attitudes of revulsion around matter out of place to be the dominant mode of engagement, while still being able to hold on to the notion of homosexuality as sin. A second sociological dimension, first being matter out of place, was sexuality as identity, to which I came to see that sexuality is fragmentary as human identity. What is a homosexual? Is that all that that person is? One's sexual behavior can never fully define one's personhood, and therefore to call someone a homosexual can only identify a portion of who they are. Likewise, male heterosexuality can never fully define someone as a real man. If you're looking for definitions of real man that are tied to sexual behavior, you need to look no further than Jamal and Junebug. I think we're searching for a higher truth. True manhood and womanhood flow from the Imago Dei and not from sexual practice. Therefore, a just pastoral response to people participating in homosexual behavior or in any sinful behavior requires an understanding of their identity beyond sexual practice. Persons can never be fully defined by, personhood can never fully be achieved by any type of sexual behavior. Jesus transforms dirt into medicine, redeeming that which is out of place. And so I do believe that there is salvation available for those who practice homosexual behavior or any other dirty stuff. Jesus sets us free from sin. Sin, as those of you in my prophetic ministry class know, I define as alienation and that which separates. And therefore, that which separates us from from God and from each other, including our attitudes towards homosexuality, must be overcome through our oneness in Christ. Jesus makes people whole, sending his Spirit into every aspect of an individual's life. Jesus does not throw away dirt. Jesus is not reviled by dirt. Jesus transforms it. He does not couch sin in terms of cognitive development. He names it and heals it. Jesus does not lift sexuality and sexual behavior to definitive human status, a definitive status of what it means to be human. Rather, as part of the Trinity at creation, Jesus blessed humanity, and with it, he blessed the union consistent in a manner of his union with the church. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Did you use the call?
Y'all told me 10 minutes.
Thank you. Next, we'll have contributions from Orlando and Mark.
Can you hear me? Okay. It's been a lot of information said today. I feel like I need to be out there sitting down just taking notes from Dr. Bellis, Dr. Newheart, and Dr. Trulear. It's always interesting to sit back and listen to just their perspectives, especially the biblical Old Testament perspective and the New Testament perspective, and then hearing Dr. Trulear. I always love hearing Dr. Trulear's sociological point of view of how life is and how we operate. That is just great. I think that was a very vivid presentation of it. I like that very much. Can I take it and use it if I were to so much?
Margaret Mead says yes.
But I guess I'm supposed to be here to sit and talk on the contemporary as far as this marriage issue is concerned. As far as it's concerned with marriage equality. I spoke with one person and I said marriage equality. The first thing that came to my mind was how a man and a woman should operate in a marriage. Never considering the idea of equality as far as a man marrying a man or a woman marrying a woman, or a man marrying a woman or a woman marrying a man for that matter. But this is the part we're brought to today, considering that we've started out with speaking about gender roles and what does it take to define us as a man and what does it take to define us as a woman. And for me, it's more so an individual thing, or of who you are, defining who you are as a man and as a woman in the culture that you've been taking into consideration that, and all of this is moving us towards wholeness. And I don't know if that's been mentioned at all. Again, the topic for these three lectures has been towards wholeness. And so what does that mean when it's wholeness? And then the next session was the sexuality and how that relates to you as an individual, how you consider your own sexuality and how that defines you as who you are, being that we are sexual creatures. And now we're to this marriage topic. And what do I say, considering everything that has already been said? So now we've got an understanding of defining who we are as a man and a woman. We have an understanding as how we define ourselves individually, sexually. So what does that mean when we say marriage? Usually people, when they are married, one of the things they do as they refer to their significant others, the first thing they say is that person is my better. Okay, so I guess in a marriage, I guess that makes you whole now because you've got a half here and a half here. Well, what I would have to say to that really is you should know who you are completely whole to begin with, being that this is toward wholeness. So, taking into consideration everything that has already been said as far as how the biblical text has taught us and brought us to this point of what marriage is. And we've taken into consideration the sodomites, we've taken into consideration even the polygamous issues that were in there, which one of those things we don't really talk too much about polygamy nowadays, and that's also a marriage issue, but we more focus on homosexuality and heterosexual fornication rather than polygamy, but that's another topic. But continuing on, how it used to be looked at in a culture of medieval times that moved us into a Victorian period where we had to refrain from showing a lot of our sexual acts to the point where sexuality was completely demonized and it was only for procreation. The very first thing God ever commanded man to do was be fruitful and multiply. And as Dr. Bellis said earlier, the reason for the text, or at least for some people interpreting the text that way, was for the God's chosen people to be more fruitful and have more children, considering the high death rate of infancy and wars and people just being people killing each other. But now we're in a time period, now we're in the slave period, and I'm going to speak specifically towards the African American culture because that's the culture that I'm raised with, and that's the only thing I can speak upon as to actually talk to you about in this contemporary culture as it's concerned. As far as it's concerned, how did I get to my sexuality? How did I get to me defining myself as a man, to my sexuality, to, well, I'm not married, but you know, the idea of marriage is from slavery. Because a lot of our culture, we do not take into consideration the African traditions of marriage, being that we are African American. We take into consideration as far as our marriage rights and rituals, it's very much so Eurocentric. So with that being said, we're moving away from the slavery point into the, let's say, 1930s, in a time period where men and women married, and when they got married, it was the man's job to go out and work, and it was the woman's role to stay at home and raise the kids. That's what marriage was in that time period. That's how marriage was defined. Now we're moving on into let's move very far ahead, make it quickly so I don't have to spend all this time and let you talk, guys. Let's move into the 90s where you've got the independent woman movement, and now every woman is independent, but at the same time, every woman being independent, you've got the single family households now starting to emerge. And women are raising children by themselves, men are raising children by themselves, and it's almost like it's moved into a polygamous relationship that's not even marriage anymore. It's more so, I have 16 kids now, but 3 different baby mamas. Those types of things. That is the culture that we are currently in. And so now we are in this time period, and what I'm really trying to say is, how are we going to now define what family is and what marriage is for us individually? Who is it that, how do we say that we are defining what marriage is for us? And how can I, being an individual person, that I have my personal relationship with God, say that for somebody else, what is right and what is wrong? I first have to know what it is for me before I can ever say anything to anyone else to try and help them to be whole, exactly who they are.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
In the back?
Yes.
First of all, to this esteemed panel, you all have definitely offered much for us to digest from various perspectives. Very appreciative of all that you all have offered. Again, I echo the sentiments of my colleague in offering to you contemporary considerations for marriage equality, same-gender loving relationships. As Orlando just stated, he tried to give for us an evolution of the way in which we interpret what marriage is, how we understand our values. I want to take this conversation and my perspective on a different turn. Under contemporary consideration, I'd like to offer entry into the evolution of interpersonal relationships as it relates to communication and fidelity. Because ultimately marriage, whether it's same-gender loving or heterosexual, it's a relationship. And under this contemporary umbrella, I find it very, very useful for us to deal with technology. And the ways in which technology is now shaping for us how we deal with interpersonal relationships, or maybe the way that that's even phasing out for us. As Dustin stated earlier for us, the fact that we're blogging this session right now online is a mode in which we're now communicating. Great philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero said, nothing is more noble, nothing is more venerable than fidelity. Faithfulness and truth are the most sacred excellence and endowments of the human mind. And in that, just understanding fidelity within a marriage, fidelity within whether a same-gender marriage or a heterosexual marriage, the key to having fidelity is faithfulness. And that faithfulness is built on communication. And so technology, in a sense, through social networking, is creating for us a new framework for our young people, for our young adults, to communicate with one another. And what it's creating for us is not necessarily I want to call it a homo identity. And a homo identity is essentially this identity that we create for the world to see. But that identity, it should reflect who we are, but a lot of times that affects the person who we are in the closet. And that particular individual is now being pushed onto the world via, well, it used to be Black Planet, then that emerged to MySpace, and from MySpace we emerged to Facebook. From Facebook now we've gone into Twitter. And it's amazing how those frameworks and those social networks has created for us a new way of understanding our relationships with one another. Black Planet for us was something that was before MySpace, but it was for a specific demographic, Black people. That's why it was called Black Planet. But alongside Black Planet, you also had White Planet, you also had Red Planet or Asian Planet. But those social networks were essentially designed for specific demographics of people. But then that got improved upon, and MySpace emerged. And what MySpace enabled us to do was to create a space for all persons to come together, to communicate, to share with one another. And through MySpace, we were able to be exposed to a number of ways of understanding who we are. Now, how does this relate to our conversation? Well, it begins when you're exposed to more than one ideology of what a relationship is or what a marriage can be. That begins to change, and it begins to help to create for you a different framework when you come to a same-gender loving relationship or, a heterosexual polygamous relationship for that matter. Because now you can connect a person, a face, and an identity with something that you may have read about or never could have even imagined. So this world is now opened up to a whole generation of people, and now they have to begin to digest it. That was MySpace. Well, Facebook came along, and they tried to make it a little bit more exclusive, because you couldn't join Facebook at one time unless you had a college email. And so the idea behind that was so that you could actually connect closer to the people who you may bump shoulders with every day. So this concept of having friends. So the young lady or the young man who I sit next to in class and I may not have enough gall to go and approach because I may find her attractive or may find him attractive, I can now go and look that person up on Facebook and figure all about this person, what type of music they like, what type of videos are they into, what type of movies do they like. Because then I can maybe start a conversation with them or befriend them so that I can kind of begin a conversation with them. But this created a different type of framework for us understanding how to deal with interpersonal relationships. And so, but then it even got a little theological, Dr. Hobson. We moved from Facebook, and then they moved into Twitter, and they said, well, we need to have some followers. Doesn't that sound familiar? So we moved from friends, and now we want our identity to mean even more to us. So it's important that I have people who are willing to follow me based on the things that are going on in my life every day, almost every moment of course of my day. And so, again, it's beginning to shift on how we understand or how we interact with one another. And so when we come to this contemporary understanding of marriage and same-gender loving relationships, I just want to challenge the audience today in this conversation, this dialogue that we have some time prayfully left to have. I'm going to shut up soon. Prayfully that we can begin to work out a way in which we're going to have to understand as a faith community, as a faith tradition, how we're going to be able to interact with these persons who are now exposed and connected to individuals who are now affecting our framework of family values, of how we understand same-gender love relationships. I actually want to argue that these social networks have actually been the very catalyst for this huge outspring of same-gender loving relationships. It's actually just created the type of space where people can be free. And it's been liberating to such an extent that you have this whole generation of young people, if you go to any local middle or high school, of individuals who are saying, look, this is who I am. And had this space not been created, it would have remained in the closet. So now we're having to reckon with, as a church, as a faith community, as a theological community, how do we deal with these type of individuals who are now coming out in such huge numbers that already existed, but at the end of the day, now we have to begin to work out this new framework in which we have these new relationships that are being created. And that's my time.
Mark Johnson, another hand as well. Thank you so much, gentlemen. That was great. All right. Now's the time for the Q&A. And it was quiet. All right, so we have a couple options. You can come to the microphone if you would like to present your question to the panel and to our community that way, or you can also write your question down on an index card and someone will pick it up. Oh, Dr. McDaniels, Dean McDaniels will pick it up. All right, so we're going to start off the Q&A with a question. Anyone want to answer anything? And this question is from our blog.
What's the address of that?
HUSD.blogspot.com. blogspot.com.
All right, our first question. If sex is only for procreation, then is condoms, oral sex, anal sex by heterosexuals a sin?
Say it one more time.
Sure. If sex is only for procreation, then do we describe the use of condoms, the practice of oral sex and anal sex as a sin if these things are done by heterosexuals?
Yeah.
Yes.
If we define it,
We define it as sin, yes.
that's why the Catholic Church is against it. Oh, the answer is yes. That's why the Catholic Church doesn't practice birth control, because sex is only for procreation. So I don't know. There's no way on the panel that had that position. I do take the position that sex is only to be participated within the context of marriage, but I would not argue that within the context of marriage it's only procreation. So that's kind of a trick to that question, because it narrows the context to procreation. So I don't know if the block really wants to expand or what, but it's kind of easy to place where the answer. It's sort of like, if it's raining, is it wet? Oh, yeah.
Well, would you say that sex is intended for procreation only?
No, I wouldn't say that. And even as someone who believes in sex it's to be practiced within the context of marriage. I would not say it's appropriation.
No, I disagree.
I would argue that it is also a sign of intimacy. It's a physical sign that demonstrates a spiritual intimacy, and that the distinctive practice of sexual intercourse reflects a distinctive spiritual union within the context of marriage. So, but I would not limit the appropriation.
If you limited it that way, a couple where the woman had to have a hysterectomy would be excluded from sex. A couple where they were known to be unable to have children would be excluded from having sex. I mean, that...
A lot of old people, too.
Yeah, right. Yeah, everybody has menopause or age excluded.
Orlando, did you have a comment?
I'll say something. I'm going to push back a bit differently from everybody else, and probably, pretty much everybody already knows I do push back from what the normal saying is. I would say that sexuality, I agree with what they're saying as far as sexuality. Can you hear me without this? Because it's getting on my nerves. All right. Sexuality is more than, I agree with them, sexuality is more than just an act of procreation. I do agree that it is a binding experience of energy as well with the two people who are partaking in the act itself. Sex is also for pleasure in its being. It is also a form of intimacy, just like Dr. Trulear said. But I would not say that sex, for me, this is for me, I cannot say that sexuality, or just the act of sex itself, is just tied to the marriage. Now, I would say that being, like I said earlier, as far as how we define marriage today, that also takes into consideration how we define how we define the act of sex in itself. Nowadays, you have, this day and age, majority of people are getting master's degrees and doctor's degrees and going to school full time before they go through what used to be you graduate from school, you get married, you have a family, and you continue to work, you have grandkids, and you do everything. You kick your kids out, and you go cross seas, and you celebrate life with your significant other after pretty much your sex drive in life had died out because you already raised your kids and everything. But this day and age, I would argue that you would have to redefine how we look at sexuality as a whole, including the act of sex. So being that majority of us are having families later in life, how does that hold up for us to hold to marriage for sex, being that we are now 30 and 35 getting our doctorate degrees, and now we're trying to have a family, so we should wait until that time period, being that biologically speaking, our bodies become active for reproduction at a very early age, within your teens, I think it is, that you become available to actually reproduce as it is. And also, I would say part of being any type of relationship that you are in, be it male to male, female to female, female to male, whatever it may be, part of that relationship, I would say, is also being in a sexual relationship. That doesn't necessarily mean that every relationship you get into, I'm not advocating that you go out and have sex with every single relationship that you get into, but I would say that knowing who you are, and being in that relationship, that you're trying to move somewhere, go somewhere with this relationship, that you go through the motions of being what it is that you are looking for in life.
Just a quick add-on comment. I think both studies and certainly my own anecdotal evidence tells me that, at least within my own tradition, that the majority of weddings done by minister friends of mine are done for people who have had sex before marriage.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, please come to the microphone.
Questions, mine may not be really questions, they may be just responses. I was just kind of listening to the panel today, and some of the things I was trying to really get a point. I wanted to really get a clear point on, is same-sex marriage good or is it bad? I really never got the necessary answer I needed to be able to make a decision on which way to continue on with this journey of where we are today. And so I'm kind of back at the same place I was at when I came in the door, and that was that this thing must be a sin issue still, and because I think Dr. Newheart, you attempted to deal with the sin issue yourself, but I still didn't get clarity in it, because it seems like there's a much broader position that we must look at for understanding this whole sexuality and same-sex marriage. Then I'm saying that to say that if I look at it from a traditional perspective, and I'm more of a traditionalist, and I don't believe in same-sex marriage or in the whole sexuality piece of homosexuality. I'm not a homophobic, because I'm not, to be a homophobic means that one is afraid of an individual, so I'm not afraid of an individual. I have no phobias. But my point is that what is sin? Because we never dealt with the sin issue. How do you attempt to be able to say what sin is? What is sexual immorality? Because if that's it, and because what I've heard today, that just about anything can be can go. I mean, I'm a pastor, so I preach to the congregation. So I'm trying to define, how do you address the issues of sin? Because if same-sex marriage is not wrong, then bestiality is not wrong. Polygamy is not wrong. Gambling is not wrong. I mean, somewhere down the line, we have to be able to say that this is right or wrong. I mean, if we look at it from a theological perspective, and I listen to it from a philosophical perspective, but I have not really heard a clear-cut theological perspective of what is wrong and what's right. We attempted to do it, but we have not made that point. So I'm going back out the door with the same approach I came in with, that the sin issue is still the same. And so I'm sorry.
Yeah, because you had a lot there. You called my name, so I'll take the first shot at it, first right of refusal. It's important as a pastor never to preach against any sin you've not committed. But no, that's not true. Seriously, I mean, what is, I heard a couple questions there. I mean, your final question, what is sin? Your initial question concerned same-sex marriage. I guess, are we for same-sex marriage? I don't know that I'm for marriage. I am for marriage if the couple is committed to one another, is committed to the dignity of one another, is committed to justice within the world, and that they feel a leading from God and also from their community, which affirms that, to join their lives together. And I would say that is true. As we go in and out with this sound. Hello? That's on. It's on. I'm not sure what I'm doing. Here, that's segment off. It's the microphone. That'd be fine. straight, yes. And, anyway, it is the microphone. But anyway, I would say that that would be true whether you have a opposite sex or same sex. That is, it is the mutual relationship, the mutual upbuilding. And as just a short answer in terms of what is sin, sin is that which degrades the dignity of another person. I'll stop with that.
Is it the dignity of another person or is it the dignity of society itself?
Well, if you're asking, I'm trying to think about the dignity of society. I'm not sure exactly. I mean, certainly the dignity of a portion of society. I mean, in which obviously you have, let's say, during the 60s and before, you had, whites only. I mean, that was a degrading, that was a sinful structure. And I think that certainly discriminatory actions against, other segments of society, with gays, women, men, the disabled, etc. Is sinful. I guess I'm not, in terms of the dignity of society at large, I guess I need some help on that.
Jesus was asked, what do I need to do? And he gave the two great laws, both of which, of course, come out of the Hebrew Bible. Love God and love your neighbor. Everything else is commentary. St. Augustine said, love God and do what you will. Meaning, if you truly love God, everything else is commentary. Did you hear that?
Yeah, I heard it.
Okay, yeah. Love God, love your neighbor. And if you truly love God, everything else will fall into place. And everything in the Bible is a spelling out of what that means within the cultural context of the time. And we study the Bible to understand the particulars of what was going on at the time so that we can compare the particulars then and the principles that grow out of those particulars to what's going on now. Because it's never simple. The principles seem simple, but then when you try to apply them, it gets complicated. And this is going in and out too.
I don't see my role either on this panel or on this faculty as getting people to agree with me. Or as trying to win people over to a particular position on this particular issue. There are others where I would like to see movement. My experience is, after walking through this for 30 some odd years in ministry, is that the lines are drawn and that some people are on this side and some people are on that side. So where I come into the conversation is not so much agreeing with my position, but establishing a way for us to talk to each other, because what's really making me disgusted and repulsive is people on my side who resort to caricature of positions that are quote-unquote liberal, and liberals who call me Neanderthal and unthinking and all other kinds of stuff because I happen to think it's sin. And my interpretation of the Bible disagrees with theirs. And so I think the ability of seminary in general, and those of you in my class, you've heard me say this, the ability of seminaries in general to settle these arguments is vastly overrated. The ability of seminary as an institution to give you truth that you can walk out the door with is vastly overrated, and as faculty, we help perpetuate that because that myth feeds into our own sense of ego. Yeah, so that there's a whole lot of data for a conversation. I'm not going to try to argue with what they did. I can't read Hebrew, I can't read Greek, but I am going to go home and find some folks that can read Hebrew and Greek that disagree with them. That's my next step. I'd be an idiot to try to, they may pull out some Acadians and all kinds of stuff. I can't do that. So for me, I'm trying to diffuse the emotional nature of the conversation so we can actually get at the truth of the conversation. And we're not going to do that with Adam and Steve comments, and we're not going to do that with Neanderthal comments.
Amen.